closer, breathing the light. Morning hum in the garden high. Every wing has a story to tell. Every root knows how to heal. We listen, we learn, we gather and grow. We're the bees and the wild things know.
Hello, bee enthusiasts. Welcome back to the Attic Bee Podcast. I'm your host, Jody Schramm. As the United States approaches its 250th anniversary, many of us are reflecting on the people, events, and ideas that shaped the nation we know today. We often think about the founding fathers, revolutionary battles, colonial settlements, and declarations of independence. But hidden in the background of those stories is a much smaller contributor, one that arrived in wooden ships, settled alongside colonists, and became an essential part of daily life. Today, we're talking about honeybees in colonial America. We'll explore where these bees came from, why they were so important to early settlers, how people kept them before modern equipment existed, and the many ways honey, wax, and other hive products supported colonial life. We'll also look at some of the folklore and beliefs that surrounded bees during this period. It's a fascinating story because honeybees were more than agricultural helpers. They were symbols of industry, thrift, prosperity, and community. In many ways, the values associated with honeybees mirrored the values that colonists believed were necessary for building a new society. So let's travel back in time. One of the most surprising facts about honeybees is that the familiar European honeybee was not originally native to North America. Long before European settlement, the continent was home to thousands of native pollinator species, including native bees, butterflies, moths, beetles, and flies. But the honeybee we know today, Apis mellifera, evolved in Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia. So when English colonists arrived in the early 1600s, they quickly realized something was missing from their new settlements. They had become accustomed to honey and beeswax in Europe, and those products played important roles in everyday life. At some point during the early 17th century, honeybees were brought across the Atlantic by European settlers. Historians generally believe the first honeybee colonies arrived in Virginia sometime between 1621 and 1622. Colonists transported bees in straw skeps or wooden containers aboard ships. Imagine the challenge of carrying living insects across the ocean on voyages that could last months. Those colonists had to keep the colonies alive through storms, temperature fluctuations, and limited food supplies. Yet, they considered that effort worthwhile. Once established, honeybees spread rapidly throughout the colonies. As settlements expanded westward, the bees expanded too. Swarms often escaped from managed colonies and established themselves in hollow trees. Native American communities sometimes noticed honeybees arriving even before the settlers themselves. In fact, some indigenous peoples referred to honeybees as the white man's fly because the insects seemed to accompany European expansion. The observation was remarkably accurate because where colonists went, honeybees followed. Today, when we think of honeybees, pollination often comes to mind first, and this is Pollinator Week. But in colonial America, pollination was only one part of their value. honey was one of the few readily available sweeteners that they could obtain. Remember, refined sugar was expensive and often imported. So for families, honey represented an important local source of sweetness. It could be used in cooking, baking, preserving fruits, and making beverages. Beeswax was equally valuable. Before electricity, people depended on candles. Tallow candles made from animal fat were common, but they often smoked and smelled kind of unpleasant, and they burned unevenly. By contrast, beeswax candles burned cleaner, brighter, and with a pleasant aroma. Churches especially prized beeswax candles because they produced less soot and were considered more refined. Wax also found its way into furniture polish, leather treatments, waterproofing compounds, medicinal preparations, and household products. A productive apiary could provide a family with both useful materials and valuable goods for trade. In a world where self-sufficiency mattered, bees were remarkably productive livestock. They required little land, gathered their own food, and produced multiple useful products. That's a pretty compelling return on investment. Modern beekeepers are accustomed to removable frame hives, smokers, protective suits, hive tools, and extractors. Colonial beekeepers had none of these things. Most early beekeeping practices came directly from Europe, and the most common hive was the skep. A skep is a basket woven from straw or coiled grasses, typically shaped like an upside-down bowl, sort of a dome. And the bees built their comb freely inside that hollow structure. Skeps were pretty inexpensive and easy to construct, making them very popular among ordinary households. Some colonists also used hollow logs as bee gums, and these were sections of tree trunks that had been hollowed out or naturally hollowed by decay. A board covered the top, while a small entrance allowed bees to come and go. Both skeps and bee gums provided shelter, but they had a significant drawback. The comb itself could not be removed individually. So as a result, harvesting honey was difficult and often destructive. In many cases, beekeepers harvested honey by removing the entire colony. And this sounds kind of shocking to modern beekeepers, but it was a common practice for centuries. Sometimes colonies were killed with sulfur fumes so that honey and wax could be collected. Other beekeepers attempted to save part of the colony through various methods, but hive management was far less sophisticated than what we know today. The concept of removable frames would not emerge until the 19th century with the work of figures like Lorenzo Langstroth. Colonial beekeepers relied heavily on observation and some inherited knowledge rather than scientific understanding. So think about how much today's beekeepers know. We understand queens, drones, workers, genetics, diseases, parasites, pheromones, nutrition, and seasonal colony cycles. Colonial beekeepers knew much less, and yet they were often surprisingly skilled observers. They did recognize the importance of swarming and watched carefully for signs that colonies might divide. When a swarm emerged, families rushed outside with baskets, boxes, poles, whatever containers they could find. And capturing a swarm represented an opportunity to increase somebody's bee holdings at zero cost. We still sort of feel that way. Some beekeepers beat pots and pans or rang bells while swarms flew overhead. Whether this actually helped settle a swarm is doubtful, but the practice became widespread throughout Europe and colonial America. Some believed the noise encouraged bees to land nearby. Others believed it announced ownership of the swarm to neighbors. Regardless of the reason, it became a well-known tradition. Colonial beekeepers also paid close attention to flowering seasons. Without bloom calendars, they relied on experience and local knowledge. They knew when fruit trees blossomed. They knew when clover appeared. They understood that healthy landscapes supported healthy colonies. And in many ways, they practiced a form of ecological observation that modern beekeepers still value today. Taking a look at honey, honey served far more purposes than simply sweetening tea or drizzling over yogurt. Colonial cooks used honey in breads, cakes, puddings, sauces, preserves, basically anything that needed sweetening. Because refrigeration didn't exist back then, food preservation was a constant problem. Honey's natural antimicrobial properties made it useful in preserving certain foods. Those families also produced mead, one of the world's oldest alcoholic beverages. Made from fermented honey, mead had deep roots in European tradition and remained popular among many colonists. Honey appeared in home remedies as well. Although modern medicine recognizes limits to folk treatments, honey has genuine antibacterial properties and has been used for wound care for thousands of years. So colonial households often included honey in remedies for things like sore throats, coughs, and little cuts and scrapes and burns. When access to trained physicians was limited, home medicine played a significant role in everyday life and often included honey. So if honey was the sweet treasure of the hive, beeswax was the practical treasure. Imagine colonial life after sunset. There were no electrical lights. Every household depended on some form of illumination, and beeswax candles were considered premium products. They burned cleanly, emitted little smoke, and produced a really bright flame. Religious institutions especially valued them. Wax also found uses in sealing letters and documents. Important papers could be secured with wax seals bearing personal or official marks. Furniture makers used wax finishes. Leather workers used wax treatments. Textile workers incorporated wax into various applications. So, in many ways, beeswax was a versatile industrial material long before industrialization actually arrived. Now, I always like stepping into the world of folklore. So, one of the many beliefs surrounding bees traveled from Europe to the colonies. One of the most enduring traditions was called telling the bees. According to this custom, bees were considered members of the household community. When important events occurred, especially deaths, marriages, or births, the bees were informed. Family members might walk to the hives and speak to them directly. If the bees were not told about major life events, some believed the colony might leave, stop producing honey, or could suffer some sort of misfortune. To our modern ears, this sounds odd, but I think it reflects something pretty profound, and that is people recognized bees as living partners in daily life. Their survival mattered, their productivity mattered, and many of those colonial households felt genuine emotional connections to them. Another belief held that bees could sense human character. Some people thought bees responded differently to kind individuals than to dishonest or cruel ones. Other traditions suggested that swarms settling on a property could signal good fortune or prosperity. Bees frequently appeared in moral lessons as symbols of diligence or cooperation, always of industriousness. Colonial children often encountered stories encouraging them to emulate the hardworking nature of bees, being busy as a bee, industrious as a bee. These themes aligned closely with the values many colonists admired: discipline, community responsibility, and productive labor. As tensions with Britain increased during the 18th century, bees occasionally appeared in political symbolism. The hive represented cooperation and productive citizenship. Political writers sometimes compared successful societies to well-functioning bee colonies. The image resonated with colonists who viewed themselves as building something new through collective effort. It's very similar to a colony of bees. And although the bald eagle would eventually become the national symbol, bees enjoyed considerable popularity during the colonial and revolutionary periods. The hive symbol appeared in art and literature and civic imagery. Benjamin Franklin is known for admiring industry and thrift and practical labor, all qualities commonly associated with honeybees. And while the bees didn't fight in battles or sign declarations, they occupied an important symbolic place in the cultural imagination of the era. As America expanded, honeybees continued moving westward. Settlers frequently transported colonies into frontier regions. Swarms escaped and established wild populations. Travelers recorded sightings of feral bee colonies in forests far from established settlements. These wild colonies helped spread honeybees across our continent. By the late 18th century, honeybees had become a familiar part of American rural life. They pollinated orchards and gardens. They provided honey and wax. They contributed to local economies, and they became woven into the cultural identity of many communities. So what, if anything, can modern beekeepers learn from their colonial counterparts? One, they remind us that successful beekeeping begins with observation. Without modern technology, colonial beekeepers paid close attention to weather, bloom cycles, swarm behavior, and seasonal patterns. Two, they understood the importance of local ecosystems. Healthy landscapes do, in fact, produce healthy colonies. That lesson remains just as relevant today as it did back then. Three, they viewed bees as partners rather than machines. Whether through folklore, practical necessity, or personal affection, many colonists recognized that their well-being was tied to the well-being of their bees. And finally, they remind us that honeybees have been part of the American story from nearly the beginning. Long before interstate highways, commercial pollination contracts, or stainless steel extractors, honeybees were helping families build homes, light rooms, preserve food, and create livelihoods. As we approach America's 250th anniversary, it's worth remembering that history is not shaped only by famous individuals and dramatic events. It's also shaped by countless small relationships. The relationship between colonists and honeybees is one of those stories. Honeybees crossed the Atlantic alongside settlers seeking opportunity and a new life. They provided sweetness in a difficult world, light in dark evenings, materials for daily work, and lessons about cooperation and resilience. Today, when we open a hive, inspect a frame, or taste a spoonful of honey, we're participating in a tradition that stretches back centuries. The tools may have changed, the science has advanced, but the partnership remains. And I think that's one of the reasons beekeeping continues to captivate so many of us today. Thank you for joining me for this exploration of honeybees in colonial America. Since next Saturday is in fact the 4th of July, I will not be producing an episode for that week. I will in fact be in Utah celebrating the founding of our country in the beehive state. So until next time, take care, stay curious, and spend some time outdoors appreciating the remarkable creatures that continue to connect us to both nature and history.
As the day settles back into green, let the quiet stay with you. Tend the small things, rest and remember the high